Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Lyndon and it's always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. So in today's video I want to discuss the pros and cons of vintage saxophones as against a modern saxophone. And clearly this is a super complex question and it has so many variables that it's just impossible to say, and ultimately it's going to come down to budget and personal choice. That's really how I see it anyway. If you'd like the really short answer to should I buy a vintage saxophone, personally I think the answer is yes, you should, because they're beautiful things to own. And like anything in life, there's some pros and cons of buying a vintage sax. So let's have a look at the pros and cons of owning or buying and owning a vintage saxophone. First of all, you need to identify what kind of vintage saxophone you want and what a vintage saxophone really means to you. Personally, I think if you're going to buy anything that's older than around the mid or late 1950s, the ergonomics, in other words the way the keys are laid out on the instrument, are going to be significantly different to most modern saxophones. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I think there's some awesome saxophone players who play really quite old saxophones. For instance, Kenny G is well known for owning a really old sax that I think he's been playing since he was at high school. And I've got a feeling that Dave O'Higgins, who's one of my heroes, plays an old Con, which is probably not laid out in a super modern way, but I've got a feeling he might have had it adjusted, but I couldn't swear to that. But anything a great deal older than the 1950s is likely to be laid out in a more old-fashioned way, and that's going to take some getting used to. So for me personally, I like saxophones from about the kind of mid-50s and onwards, where compared to like a brand new saxophone, they're very similar in the way that they're laid out. And in particular, the left-hand spatula keys that are on your little finger. If you get something like a Selmer cigar cutter, for instance, those spatula keys are long and thin, and I find them really, really difficult to maneuver my way around. Having said that, if you spent 6 months playing one, you'd get used to it and it wouldn't be a problem. So it's tricky. Another factor with buying a vintage saxophone is sourcing one and where do you get it from. Now, most likely, if you buy it from a private individual second hand, then there's a whole load of considerations that you need to think about when you go to buy one privately. And those things would be, in my opinion, does it come with the original case? When was it last serviced or checked by a technician? Does it come with any mouthpieces? Has it been re-lacquered? These things are hugely significant because what personally I would want to do if I was buying a vintage saxophone is to get as original as possible. So the original case is really important, as well as, if possible, an original mouthpiece. That would be really, really nice to get, because if I ever did want to sell it on, those things would make it more desirable. Also, the question around when was it last checked and adjusted and serviced, that's really quite a big deal, because if it hasn't been checked and adjusted recently, then it might need work doing to it. If it's been sat in a cupboard for years and years and years, then there's every chance that the pads might need some attention or some other part of the saxophone needs attention. So this is something really to be taken into consideration. And if it hasn't been checked and adjusted recently, then when you come to play it, it's not going to sound as good as it would do if it's just been serviced and all the pads are in good condition. So it's going to be really difficult to get a sense of what the saxophone actually sounds like until you've done all of that work or that work has been done. So if you are going to buy a vintage saxophone, then maybe there is an argument for getting one from a dealer or a shop, because if you do get one from a dealer or a shop, it's more likely that the saxophone has been recently serviced, checked and adjusted. Then another really significant factor with vintage saxophones is going to be around the price of the instrument. Now, if you go for something like an old Selmer, then it's going to cost you a real lot of money. And that's not to say that it's not worth it, it's just going to be expensive. It's going to be inherently expensive because you're buying a piece of saxophone history. And one of the things that's really good about buying a vintage instrument is that if you buy it at a really good price, then it's likely to go up in value over time. And personally, what I've done in the past is buy a vintage instrument and then take it to my friendly technician, who would then service it, repad it, clean it, not restore it, but put it into the best condition that it's ever been in before he gives it back to me, and then that adds value to it. But of course, all of this incurs expense, so be ready to spend some money. So owning a vintage saxophone is a wonderful thing, and I'm lucky enough to own a beautiful Selmer saxophone, which I'm going to show you in a few moments, and I love it with all my heart. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. The craftsmanship is hand built. It's completely hand built by people who love saxophones and really, really care, and have been building saxophones for generations. So it is a stunning thing to own. And if I'm talking to any of my saxophone playing friends and they're like, what kind of sax have you got? And I say a Selmer, and they're like, oh wow, it's so beautiful, and they love it, and that brings me joy. On the other hand, I can't take it on holiday with me because I don't want it to get damaged, so that's a consideration. And when I take it on gigs, I have to really be careful with it all of the time. Not that I think necessarily something would happen, but it's definitely a liability. If somebody was to knock it over, it would not be bad, it would be a disaster. It really, really would. So it's, as much as I love it, it's a bit of a liability. And it does have a beautiful sound. It really, really does. And the argument with vintage saxophones may be that you're chasing a particular sound. Now I'm going to demonstrate in a few moments with my Selmer and a completely modern saxophone, which is a Chinese copy of a Mark VI, a very high grade copy. And to be honest, I'm struggling to hear the difference in sound, and that's because, in my opinion, the sound that is produced on a saxophone is 99% down to the mouthpiece, the reed, and the experience of the player concerned, or at least a very high percentage, and a much lower percentage of the type of saxophone. And I think I'll be able to clearly demonstrate this in a moment. So to summarize, vintage saxophones, tricky to get hold of. You need to have a technician ready. Perhaps you've got to spend quite a lot of money, and then you've got to look after it and insure it and make sure that nothing happens to it. It's a beautiful thing to own and could potentially go up in value. Stunning to look at, and something to be proud and joyful about. So let's have a think about modern saxophones. So if you buy a modern saxophone, let's argue that you're going to buy a new saxophone from a shop or a dealer. It's a brand new saxophone. If anything goes wrong with it, you can take it back. So I've got my own brand of saxophone, which is called the Goldington brand. This is not like a big hard sell for those, I'm just talking in general, but if I sell a saxophone to one of my clients, I look after them 100%. Anything goes wrong with it, no quibble guarantee. You're not going to get that with a vintage sax. And really that guarantee, whoever you buy your saxophone from, your new saxophone, they should give you that kind of no quibble guarantee. So there's always that. If a pad drops out, or it doesn't work in the way that it should, or it needs a check and adjustment, especially within the first 3 to 6 months, you can just take it back to where you got it and they should totally look after you. So in other words, it comes with a warranty in a way that a vintage saxophone won't. Another thing with modern saxophones is the technology, the way that they're laid out, and the technology that's been used to build them. It is really, really modern, and people are going to great lengths to improve things all of the time. So it's likely to be very playable, which is a good thing in a way that vintage saxophones sometimes aren't. As I said earlier on, they kind of can be a bit clunky and lumpy. A modern saxophone, if you get a good brand, it's going to be really, really, really nice to play. And you get a different kind of choice. So with the saxophones that I sell, and a lot of other people that sell saxophones sell, you've got a lot more choice about the finish and the amount of money that you want to spend. And if you're buying new from a shop, there might be some customization available. So for instance, again with Goldington saxophone, I've had a couple of clients order things bespoke so that they can have their own types of engraving or a special kind of finish, and other manufacturers will do that for you too. And modern saxophones are much more available. If you want to go out and buy a Mark VI, you might have to really look around before you find the right thing. It could take you months, and when sometimes I've had a client who's asked me to buy a sax on their behalf, and I've told them that it could take 6 months or a year before the right thing comes along. Because if you want to buy a new saxophone, you can just go out and do that now. Another thing with a new saxophone is that they are arguably more replaceable than a vintage instrument. Your vintage instrument might be one of a kind, or one of a few of a kind, and not very replaceable, whereas if you get a more modern instrument, then presumably there'd be lots more of them, so if something did happen to it, then you can replace it much more easily. So I've got two saxophones here. One is a modern saxophone. This is one of my own brands. This is a Goldington saxophone, and these are made in China by I think the best factory in China. They're making absolutely fantastic instruments now. This is a copy of a Selma, so that it's laid out in a very Selma-like way, and it sounds really, really nice, as you hear. So if I play, or aim to play, exactly the same thing on my, so this was made in 2022, I think, or maybe 23, but it's not very old. And this is really old. This is from, as actually as Selma Mark 6s go, this is not that old. This is a 70s model, but still 50 years or so. Now, I don't know what that's going to sound like on the recorder, but honestly, to my ear, I can't really hear a significant difference. I mean, other than the two saxophones are obviously different, so they've got their own particular sound, I can't really see a massive, I can't really hear rather, a massive difference between the two. There is a difference, but it's not really massive. This saxophone is £595, and this saxophone is about 10 times more expensive. But this is the saxophone that I take when I go on holiday, if I want to have a jam and I don't have to worry about it too much. And the way that they're laid out is uncannily similar. I think the Chinese have done an absolutely fantastic job. So that's my thoughts about vintage saxophones. It's only my opinion. I'm not trying to state facts or anything like that. It's really down to you to decide what saxophone suits you ever so well. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're enjoying my videos and you want to support the making of them, then please consider buying us a coffee, and know that we do dance around the house pretty much even when someone just says, hey, I really love your videos and thank you. It makes such a difference to our day. Anyway, thank you for coming. I really hope that this was thought-provoking for you, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.